And this is the last show we're going to do for this series of Old Newsmakers with Kevin Noren hosting them. We've got two guests for this half hour. One from June 1989. SUNY Buffalo professor Gaylene Levesque. That's from June 23rd, 1989. She had just gotten back from China and knew some of the victims of the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. That's segment one. In the second segment, it's going to be Malachi Martin talking about and predicting the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of Soviet communism, a show from 1991. We first do the June 23rd, 1989 show.
The last 24 hours, we've had a chance to get a hold of Gaylene Levesque, who is from St. Catharines in Ontario, works in Buffalo, for SUNY Buffalo. And she is just back from Beijing, or Peking, depending on how you want to say that, in China, the capital of China. She was there during the massacre, and we want to talk to her this morning. So, Gaylene, hello.
Hi.
Gaylene, you were there as part of a teaching operation, were you not?
That's right.
Tell us about that.
The University of New York at Buffalo has an exchange agreement with the Beijing Municipal Authority of Higher Education.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there to administer an English language training center that is sponsored by SUNY Buffalo.
Okay. How long were you there?
We had been there for 10 months before we had to leave.
Uh-huh. And you were there when the massacre took place?
Yes, we were.
Can you tell us what happened, what you saw, what your reaction was?
Well, we didn't actually see the massacre. Of course, tensions had been building for several weeks because of the student demonstrations, and then with the imposition of martial law, we had become rather frightened about the safety of our students and friends. Everybody was aware that the government could at any time give orders that might lead to some violence, but no one certainly ever expected the kind of violence and the massive massacre of innocent people, not just students, that was to occur on that Saturday night. My son had fallen from a swing and fractured his skull on Friday afternoon, and we had taken him into the hospital on Saturday, and it was the Peking Medical Hospital close to Tiananmen Square, and he was admitted for, they said they wanted to keep him for about a week. And a couple of my friends who are doctors came to the hospital and said, it's too dangerous to keep him here. So a little bit of violence had already broken out before the massacre occurred. We got him out of there, and we later heard within an hour the hospital was filled with dead and dying people. We were called on Saturday night. A friend of mine from the U.S. Embassy called and said, stay indoors and stay away from windows tonight. Something terrible may happen. And then a couple of my students called me and said they wanted to see me. And then on Sunday morning, Saturday night, everyone was really very nervous, although we had been nervous, I must say, for a couple of days. And we could hear gunshots, and then Sunday morning when we went out, the people on the streets were weeping. Everyone on the streets was crying. The university around the corner was playing funeral music, and the students were carrying the body of a 9-year-old boy through the streets. There were bloodied clothing hanging everywhere, and everything was just in turmoil.
Gaylene, I want to back up a minute. You said a couple of friends of yours who were doctors. Were these Chinese friends?
Yes, yes.
So they were the ones who advised you to get your son out of there.
That's right.
Where did you take your son, by the way?
We took him back to the hotel.
Even though he had a fractured skull?
Yes.
You felt he was safer there than in the hospital, obviously.
Right.
And you said that some of the students, now these would be Chinese students.
That's right.
Okay, so you knew some of these kids who may have been out there in the square.
Oh, yes. I would venture to say that everyone that we knew that was Chinese had been out in the square at one time or another. One of my friends had called me the week before, and he said, I must see you. And I said, well, I would like to see you too. And he said, yes, I must see you to say goodbye. And I said, what do you mean, goodbye? He said, well, I'm going to Tiananmen Square. I've been going every night, and I want to say goodbye to you before I die.
This kid knew that he was going to die, or felt that he was going to die?
They all said that they were willing to shed their blood for democracy and freedom, and they were all aware that the government could act, and yet on some level nobody believed they would. The student leaders and many of the students had made out their wills. I was not the only teacher who had students coming to her saying, I want to say goodbye to you, you've been so kind to me. They were frightened. You know, it wasn't as though they were just blindly going out there to die. They would weep when they said goodbye, and they would say, I'm so frightened, I'm so frightened. But if this is what it takes to awaken China, then I'm willing to do it.
Gaylene, these youngsters, when you say friends, I assume all the time you're talking about Chinese friends and Chinese students. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you lose any of your friends there? Any of your students?
Yes, and I don't know how many. On Tuesday, I heard that 10 of my students were still alive. You know, when the soldiers went into the square, not only did they shoot and kill everyone, but they ran over people with their tanks, and they ran over them back and forth many, many times so that bodies could not be identified, and they burned bodies, and they were decapitating bodies, and they were piling bodies into trucks and buses to take them out of town for burning, because they didn't want to have an accurate count, and they didn't want people to be able to identify their friends and relatives. And so that's why they were killing ambulance drivers and Red Cross workers and ordinary citizens who were trying to grab the wounded and take them to hospitals, because they didn't want the world to ever know just what they had done. But, you know, everybody talks about the massacre on the square, but, you know, there were many, many more people than that killed, because the citizens of Beijing had set up blockades all on the outskirts of the city and in every intersection in the city to try and stop the soldiers. And so not just students were killed, but old people, grandmothers who... One of my students told me she saw a grandmother who went up and said, if you want to kill the students, you'll have to kill me first, and laid down underneath the wheels of a tank. They killed children. I left on Wednesday, and a student told me that on Tuesday, 16 people in his neighborhood alone were killed, and one of them was a 7-year-old girl who was machine gunned by soldiers as she walked home with a bag of tomatoes for her family. One of the teachers that I sent her called me on Monday, and she said, I'm so frightened. The soldiers... Now, these are ordinary citizens. The soldiers have surrounded our apartment building, and they're shooting at the windows. And she said, oh, I'm so afraid I'm going to die. And then the line went dead. And I never heard from her again and couldn't get through to her. So I don't know. I don't know how many of our friends have died. And what's happening now, I think, is even worse, because now they're having mass arrests, and to be arrested, I mean, they have a telephone line that people can just call in and accuse people, and once you're accused, there's no investigation. You can be accused of anything, and you have no right to answer the accusation. And of course, many of our friends and students could very well be accused of befriending Americans and of having thoughts of democracy and liberty and justice.
Gaylene Levesque is with us, a very moving story. Gaylene, I want to talk about the democracy thing. This is something that's confused me and I think many others. These kids told you they were out there and ready to die for democracy. What did they mean by democracy?
Well, you know, there were many leaders who thought there had been too much opening to the West, and I think that some kind of movement like this was inevitable. They met Europeans and Americans, in particular Americans, and they studied American history. My husband taught American studies at 2 universities there, and they were just so taken with this idea that people had rights and that people could vote. I also do not understand how people who had never experienced the least bit of democracy or freedom could have such a burning love in their hearts for the concept. They would quote George Washington to us, and they would quote different presidents and in their essays all the time. And it was as if. Well, the only thing I can say, Kevin, is it was as if there is truth somewhere, and that they had tapped into truth and all the ugliness and darkness that they had had to live with all their lives, couldn't put out this light.
So they really were talking about freedom as we understand it, and not just another form of communism?
Well, no, they were very clever. I mean, they were saying we love the Communist Party, we just want reforms, but the kinds of reforms they wanted,
Communists couldn't allow. Is that right?
They wanted freedom of
Sure.
speech, they wanted freedom of assembly, they wanted freedom of the press. We went down to the official news agency, Xinhua News Agency, which was opened during the demonstrations for the first time in its history, and the journalists there were just, it was quite amazing. One journalist had a big piece of tape over his mouth, and it said, "Have mouth, can't speak." They were carrying signs saying, "Government, why are you afraid of truth? The truth will set the people free. And we are tired of telling lies. Let us speak the truth." So that the people, all people, knew there was truth, and then they knew there was the party line. So they had hoped to get it through reform, but there were still many, many people who said, you can't just cut off the rotten fruit, you have to dig out the rotting roots. And a lot of them thought those rotting roots were the Communist Party.
So they really were on to something, that it wasn't just a movement to replace one kind of a communist sleazeball with another kind of communist sleazeball. Is that right?
Well, that's what we felt.
Mm-hmm. Well, you should know, you were there.
I know, but I'm afraid of saying something that will get people in more trouble.
I understand. Gaylene, a reign of terror has descended on that country, not unlike the reign of terror in France 200 years ago.
I know, and they kept comparing themselves to that. Often they would carry signs that would say, that they were inspired by the French Revolution.
Well, they're reaping the fruits of the French Revolution, too. But this reign of terror that's going on now, in many ways, I suspect, will take more victims than the massacre.
Oh, definitely. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there were millions of victims during the Cultural Revolution, and I'm sure the same will happen. People are turning against their relatives. People are so frightened they're turning people in. It's just mindless torture and repression.
Gaylene, I'm sure you're aware of this, but I'm going to back up a little bit to when Mao Zedong took over. Here was the policy the Chinese communists used to great effect, and I talked to someone who was there at the time. They would tell a neighbor, look, your responsibility is to watch your neighbor. If he does anything subversive, you are to report him. And if he does it and you haven't reported him, then you'll go to jail too. The bottom line was they had neighbors turning in neighbors. And that has been the system in communist China from the very first days of Mao Zedong. So what they're doing now is merely a reversal, or was that in continuation? Did you see that when you were there, when you first went there?
Well, every apartment building had its committee members that would meet weekly, and every work unit had political meetings every week. And yes, they were expected to turn each other in. And I would say to the students and the teachers, you shouldn't be discussing these issues. They would be talking about freedom and how unjust their government was. And I would say, you shouldn't be discussing this. It's too dangerous. And they would say, I don't care. I don't care. I'm tired of the lies. I don't care anymore what happens to me. And I knew the history of China too, and they knew. Many of the students I had, well, my students were actually university professors. They had been through the Cultural Revolution. They had horrifying stories to tell of how they were tortured and punished, and their families were punished. And they still would speak out. And I would say, for heaven's sakes. And they said, well, the thing is, everyone has kept quiet too long, and as long as we keep quiet, then the lies can continue.
They were prepared to be martyrs, is what you're saying.
That's right.
Gaylene, this business about the two armies, the first army that went in and didn't break up the demonstrators, didn't clear out the square. Some stories say it's because they were close to the students themselves, that they were from that area, that many of them had been students. Or there's another story that says the communist Chinese leadership just had not made a final decision yet, and that army would have cleaned them out just like the other army did. What's your view on that?
Oh, see, you know, that's difficult because the Communist Party is just so sneaky that you couldn't second guess them, and the students themselves were confused. But when the first army came in, it was quite clear that they didn't know what was going on. And the people, the students tried to talk to them, but the ordinary people were more successful than the students. The army members were not educated people. They were peasants from the countryside. And this frightened the students because there's always been a hatred of intellectuals in China, especially since Mao took power. But the ordinary people were going and saying, this is what's happening. You know, we had freedom of press for 4 or 5 days. And the people would take out the newspapers and the pictures and show them to the students, or to the army, to the soldiers. And the soldiers said that they had not talked to anybody, nor had they been able to read mail or watch TV or hear the radio for weeks, and that they had been told they were going in to shoot a movie, that they were going to be extras in a film. And when the people talked to them, and fed them and took care of them, they said, well, we will never kill our brothers and sisters. Now, what I said to some of the people was, I think your army is not very well trained. I mean, in any country in the world, if the government says go in there and break this up, every army would do that. And I was told that this is because I didn't understand something about China, and that is that the army has always been told that they are the People's Liberation Army, that they were trained to attack out or defend the country or to attack outsiders. But they had been brainwashed into believing that they were the army of the people. So when a general said to them, go in there, he's just one man, and a man that they know is corrupt. And they go in there and they talk to the people, and the people say, no, this is not what is true, that they feel their loyalty to the people, not to the upper echelon. The last army that came in really frightened the people because they wouldn't talk to the people, and when the people tried to give them food, they would throw it at the people, and they wouldn't take the newspapers. And many people said to me, you know, we think this army doesn't even speak Chinese because they won't talk to us, they won't answer us, they don't seem to understand us.
Gaylene, I hate to stop you there, but I'm afraid our time is up. May we continue this conversation in a week or so?
Sure.
I really appreciate it. It's been very moving talking to you. Thank you very much. Gaylene Levesque, who is a resident of St. Catharines, Ontario, is associated with SUNY Buffalo, just back from Beijing, and tells us an incredible story about what's going on over there. We'll continue that discussion in a week or so.
WLEA, Hornell.
So some real history there from June 23rd, 1989. A SUNY Buffalo professor who had just returned from China and knew some of the victims of the Tiananmen Square shooting that year. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, we'll hear a show from January 9th, 1991, with Malachi Martin talking about the Iraq War, and also Malachi predicting the fall of the Soviet Union. Stay with us.
The New Year's Warehouse Sales event has been extended until the end of January at Mullen Factory Direct Flooring in Almond. You'll save up to 75% on over 500,000 square feet of in-stock flooring. The major name brands, hardwoods, laminate, vinyl, and carpet. Keep your cash in your pocket and take advantage of special payment options like 0% interest to qualified buyers. If you're planning a flooring project, you can't miss this sale. The New Year's Warehouse Sales event's been extended till January 31st at Mullen Factory Direct Flooring in Almond. Don't miss out on these deals.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll. And Rob, we're continuing our Newsmaker series. We just finished up one from 1989 about Tiananmen Square. Now we're about to do one about the fall of the Soviet Union, January 1991. Do you remember January 1991?
I do, because if I'm not mistaken, wasn't that the start of Desert Storm?
Yeah, that's part of the one of the topics coming up in this next segment, too.
Yep, I can remember working evenings at that time and doing a feed with a radio station in Montana, and the guy saying to me, I got to run. The AP printer is going crazy.
Oh yeah, I remember those. We used to have one of those machines, too, out in the hallway.
It was when the CNN reporters were playing hide and seek with the Iraqi authorities in the hotel room.
Peter Arnett.
Yes, yep, you are correct.
Wow, what history. Hey, Rob, what do you got for the forecast for Thursday, January 3rd, 2019?
Well, we've got some mild conditions in the forecast. It looks like it is going to have the tendency to be relatively balmy in comparison to where we could be for early January and where we were just a year ago, Brian. It was a very cold start to the year last year. The cold held up through January 6th. This year we're mild. It's helped along by the El Nino in the Pacific. We're going to be looking forward to some breaks of sunshine developing today. We're 35 to 40 this afternoon. Sun came up 7:39 this morning. It'll set tonight at 4:51. Tonight it turns partly cloudy and we're 25 to 30. For tomorrow, lots of sunshine. That's when you're going to notice the milder weather. Temperatures tomorrow afternoon, 45 to 50. Clear to partly cloudy, close to 30 tomorrow night. Looking ahead to Saturday, a mixture of clouds and sunshine, balmy, 45 to 50. Brian, we're partly sunny with temperatures back in the 40s Sunday, too.
Now back to the Newsmaker Show. This is from January 1st, 1991. Malachi Martin.
We're on the line this morning with Malachi Martin, author of many, many books. His latest is called The Keys of This Blood. And the subtitle, right from the book, The Struggle for World Dominion Between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Capitalist West. It is a provocative book. We talked to Dr. Martin just before its publication last fall, and now we are welcoming him back to the program. Good morning, Dr. Martin.
Good morning, Kevin, and how are you doing this morning?
Wonderful, and let me tell you, I've got a host of questions for you. First of all, back in the fall, when you and I spoke before the book was published,
yes,
you made reference to the term New World Order.
That's right.
Now, at that time, it wasn't being used by a lot of people.
That's right.
Now, suddenly, it's the rallying call for this war in the Middle East.
That's right.
Tell us what that means, the New World Order.
Well, I'll tell you, the New World Order is this, briefly. Those who have the money, the hegemony, the leadership in world money and in world power, have decided that the Society of Nations, that is about 168 or 170 nations, cannot get on any longer divided up into nationalities and blocks. And they have decided that we need a one-world government of a new kind. It's not a national government. It's a supervisory agency to supervise our trade and our economics and our money, our finance. Because what most people don't know is that today, on the international money markets, the globalist money markets, about 40 to 60 men play with anything from 20 to 40 or 50 billion dollars, which is a lot of dollars. And that governs the flow of capital and the flow of capital goods and decides which government will stand and which government will fall. And they're not bad men, they're just very wealthy men. And they are already in the act of setting up a multi-nation closed trade treaty, which will decide what you import and what you export. They've decided that we can't do without each other in a very, very intimate way, and that is the big change that is taking place, that there's a structure being created to group all nations in one big, happy, trading, economic, and financial family.
All right, now, as I indicated in the introduction, you say it's a struggle of John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the capitalist West. You're talking now about the capitalist West.
That's right, I am. And by the way, Kevin, you and I are capitalists. We belong to the capitalist countries, and this is our way of life. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, except that as a system, here's what John Paul II, the Pope, says about it. As a system, it is amoral. It has no morality. It's not bad or good. Its motive is profit and greater wealth and greater products and that sort of business. And that, he says, is amoral and therefore cannot produce a system which is human and which will permit human morality and divine revelation to coexist.
So he's not in favor of the capitalist West, obviously.
Not of the capitalist West as an amoral system.
Mm-hmm.
He's in favor of the liberties that capitalism allows so far, democratic capitalism, democratic egalitarianism, as we call it. But those two are being restricted more and more, as we find out.
Now, is Mikhail Gorbachev a part of this new world order?
Yes, he is. Mikhail Gorbachev has a totally different, a polar different outlook. He is a hard-headed, card-carrying, dedicated Leninist, communist. And his ideal is finally the big socialist republic of all the nations under the direction of Moscow. And that is his aim. And despite the conventional wisdom, it must be said in public again and again that never before in his life was Mikhail Gorbachev so powerful as he is today.
Well, Dr. Martin, just in case some people haven't been paying attention to the last few days, and particularly the last 24 hours, Gorbachev may be showing his true colors, many are saying.
That's right.
The crackdown is beginning now in the republics. He sent the elite paratroopers out there.
That's right. This man is the most powerful Russian, probably, that ever existed so far. And he has played his game very well, because everybody in the West is shouting Gorby, 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 and wanting to give him food and credits and joint ventures and welcome him into the new Europe, which he's going to belong to. So the game between him and the West is who will make more money, who will gain the more power. John Paul II stands back and says, likewise, communism is amoral. In fact, it is atheistic. And if that was the system imposed, or a mixture of capitalism and communism, then there will be only chaos, because morality will be lacking and religion will be lacking. And without those two, human systems cannot survive.
So he has, if you pardon the expression, he has his own game plan too then, John Paul II.
Oh, yes, he has.
Well, tell us about his game plan.
Well, his game plan is this. For 12 years now, he became Pope in 1978, October 16. He has been trekking, literally, around the world. He has visited 95 nations, speaking in 45 languages, and he has got to know every governmental leader worth knowing, big, small, and medium-sized. His influence is enormous, and his prestige is enormous. And it's a moral prestige, and it's a religious influence. And Mikhail Gorbachev himself has found it necessary, this great atheistic Soviet leader, found it necessary to come down twice to see this man in Rome, once for 71 minutes and once for 45 minutes. He has found it necessary because the Pope's influence on the populations of the Ukraine and Belarusia, another province of Russia, and in the Baltic states, and with the Russian Orthodox Church, is so enormous that Mikhail Gorbachev cannot control them without some input by the Pope.
Now, going back to the situation in the Middle East, which is certainly dominating the news now.
Sure.
Gorbachev met with Bush.
Yes.
This new world order, when that meeting took place, was Bush saying to Gorbachev, hey, look, you want to be part of this new world order? If you do, sign on. Was that what was going on there?
That's what was going on. They were making a deal. Mm-hmm. And at the present moment, most people don't know it, Kevin, but at the present moment, the 7 ministers of the 7 main European countries forming the new Europe, they're sitting down with an American representative and a Soviet representative, working out how the Soviet Union can be integrated into Western Europe economically and financially. Most people don't know that. It's taking place right now under our noses. So that the plan is to integrate Europe and the Soviet Union economically and financially, and then to extend that to the United States. And Mr. James Baker, who is now talking with Tariq Aziz in Geneva, did speak once upon a time of the vast market stretching from Vladivostok, that's the Russian city on the China Sea, this vast market, believe you me, stretching from that across the Russian heartland, across Western Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean, over to the beaches of California. It's planned as one big economic system.
So the Russians, or the communists rather, will be part of this new world order.
That's the plan.
Working side by side with the capitalist West.
That's the plan. Now, that is the game that's going on. And you know, Kevin, there's something we must remark, you and I, as 20th century men. Whenever there's a sea change, whenever a vast change is taking over in human things, we don't see it until it's a fait accompli, until it's an accomplished fact. If somebody changes a lamppost in our street, we notice it. But if the whole society is being changed in its way of life, in the way it buys food and the jobs, in the way it travels, in the way it dresses, if it all changes over a vast area, we don't notice it because we're changing and we don't notice it until it's done. And then somebody stands up and says, hey, we're not like what our fathers were.
In other words, as people live through great moments of history, they're seldom aware of it, isn't it? Is that what you're saying?
Seldom aware of it, they don't know. For instance, in 1792, every gentleman wore hose and a sword and a wig and a frock coat. By 1820, every gentleman was wearing a stovepipe hat, stovepipe trousers and a jacket, and he carried a pistol in his vest pocket. But it suddenly happened.
Dr. Martin, I hate to narrow this down to what's happening in the Middle East, but we're all thinking about that.
Yes, Kevin, that is the crux.
Now, why do you say it's the crux? What is the capitalist West, led by George Bush in this case, trying to do?
The crux there is this, that we in the West are endeavoring to set up a new balance of power. In effect, we don't want to crush Saddam Hussein. We want to balance him with Iran and Syria. At the same time, we have to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, after which a deal will be struck. And Israel is perched as the only strategic point we possess in the Middle East. But its power and influence and importance for the United States is going to diminish if that takes place. And the entire game has been to bring Saddam Hussein around to forsaking his ABC warfare, atomic and biological and chemical warfare weapons, and to get out of Kuwait and get back. And probably that will be the outcome of these talks in Geneva, despite the fact that we're told there are not going to be negotiations. But we have to have a balance of power, because we in the West are always seeking a balance of power. And that means that the situation is going to unravel, because Islam, the religion of the Middle East, will not take a compromise.
It's not going to allow us to call the shots. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, and it's going to unravel. But Kevin, let me make one prediction. The focus of our attention and crisis today is the Middle East. By February end, it will be the Eastern Europe countries, and it will be the Soviet Union.
Dr. Malachi Martin, we'll have you back to check that prediction out. And thank you very much for being with us. Dr. Malachi Martin, speaking to us from New York. Keys of This Blood is his book. It's out from Simon & Schuster, available probably at a bookstore right now, but if not, you can certainly order it, and do. It's a remarkable book with all kinds of interesting information. Next, the news, and then the local report here on WLEA. Stay tuned.
WLEA Hornell.
Malachi Martin, they say he was the #1 guest in talk radio in the 1990s. We were lucky to have him and to know him. It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell. I'm Brian O'Neill. Thanks so much for listening. I think that some of these shows with Kevin Dorn have just been absolutely fantastic. You can check them out on WLEA.net. These shows on the Kevin Dorn page at WLEA.net. You can hear him calling a ball game in the 1970s as well on the Kevin Dorn page. Lots of interesting stuff up there. I encourage you to go to the Kevin Dorn page at WLEA.net. I'm Brian O'Neill. Thanks for listening. Jonathan Mark with us tomorrow at 8:05 for the all-new Fridays at 8.